Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining this morning's webinar, which is on the topic of the activities of international organisations. My name's Amanda Wolfe. I work at Macmillan International Higher Education, and I'll be managing this morning's webinar. Before we get into the content, just to say that you're all muted at the moment, and that's because we're making a recording of today's session, and we want to be able to maintain the quality of the audio. We would very much encourage you to make any comments or ask any questions in the chat or questions box. That way we can address them as we go through the webinar and also at the end of the webinar. So as mentioned, we will be doing a recording of the session. We'll send this out to you afterwards so that should you want to, you can watch the video again, or you can share it with anybody that wasn't able to attend this morning's session. Okay then, so without further ado, I will pass you over to the host of this morning's webinar, who will take it from here.
Hello, good morning. I'm Hugo Dijkstra and I'm calling in today for Maastricht University. I'm the co-author of a textbook on international organization. Now you might be familiar with the textbook or not, that really doesn't matter, but I'm going to be talking today about the activities of international organizations. This is the third webinar on international organizations. I've previously talked about the theory and history of international organizations. I've also talked about the political system of international organizations. And now actually I'm going to be looking at the activities that international organizations undertake. So let me move immediately to the next slide with the agenda for today's webinar. There you see the table of contents of the book, and as I said in the first webinar, we've looked at the theories and history, so part 1 of the book. In the second webinar, we've looked at part 2 of the book, and today we're really going to focus on part 3 of the book. Now, as you see in the book itself, we look at different activities of international organizations. We look at peace and security, trade and development, finance, and so forth. Today, however, I will focus exclusively on peace and security. This is simply for the fact that international organizations do a lot of things, and it would take hours and hours if I would have to summarize all of that. So rather than just giving you a slim overview of all these activities of IOs, I'm really going to zoom in a bit in the area of peace and security. And I very much encourage as well if you ask questions on that. There will be a number of moments during the webinar that I will pause. We'll have a look at the questions collected, and I'll try to address them then. So let's start talking about cooperation between international organizations in the field of peace and security. Now, in the area of peace and security, it is well known that cooperation tends to be very difficult among states. States don't really trust each other very often, and they're responsible for their own security, what realists have called self-help. There's also something like a security dilemma. What one state might do to defend itself, for instance, invest in military, might be perceived by others as offensive action, and therefore others will have to invest as well in defensive measures. And as a result, there's a spiral of increased escalation that might go out of control. So with that situation in the field of security, states have looked for really quite a long time on ways to break that cycle and ways of cooperating and establish peace. Now, international organizations play traditionally a very important role here. You can think of the United Nations, you can think of alliances like NATO or the Organization of Security Cooperation in Europe, the African Union. Many other international organizations have security as part of their agenda. And traditionally, international security organizations do a number of things. For instance, they set norms about the use of force, appropriate behavior, the use of certain arms or the prohibition of certain arms. They are forums for diplomacy, and I'll talk a bit more about that. The UN Security Council, a real key forum where diplomatically conflicts are getting settled. And international organizations also help to build transparency among adversaries. They might not really, do away with the mistrust, they might not do away entirely with the security dilemma, but by providing more transparency, for instance, on nuclear programs, that countries have. That's an activity that the International Atomic Energy Agency does, creating some transparency about adversaries, and then perhaps by breaking the cycle. So there are different ways in which international security organizations are being utilized to provide peace and security. Now, what I'm really going to be zooming in today is what the United Nations does in the field of security. And I'm really looking at three things. I'm looking at the policy programs of the UN in peace and security, so the types of rules and regulations that the UN has established when it comes to security matters. I'll be looking then a bit longer into the operational activities. So how the UN tries to peacefully settle conflict, how the UN engages in peace enforcement, how the UN engages in peacekeeping, and finally I'll be talking a bit about the effectiveness of these type of operations by the UN. So the general focus here is really on the field of peace and security, and I'm looking particularly today at the role of the United Nations in this era. So let's have a look at the policy program of the United Nations. And the first thing to have a look at then is the UN Charter. You see a nice picture on the slide of the UN Charter, We the Peoples of the United Nations. And the UN Charter states quite clearly that the key objective, the principal objective of the United Nations is to maintain international peace and security. That's Article 1.1, the very first bit of the UN Charter. Is about maintaining peace and security, the objective of the UN. And to do that, the UN has a role to prevent threats to the peace, suppress acts of aggression, and bring about the settlement of international disputes. So within the UN Charter, a real role is carved out for the United Nations to address these issues. Now, the UN Charter also stipulates a very clear policy program. For instance, in Article 2.4, it notes that all members of the UN shall refrain from the threat or the use of force against the territorial integrity or the political independence of any state. In other words, if you become a member of the United Nations, you're not allowed to invade other countries. So that's a rule set by the UN Charter. It's part of the policy program of the United Nations. The policy program also stipulates that all members shall settle their international disputes by peaceful means, Article 2.3. So essentially, the UN Charter bans the use of force between states. And that's an example of the type of regulation that the UN establishes. Now, as you well know, wars still take place, and in that sense, the UN Charter is also incomplete, because there are two exceptions to the use of force. First is Article 51 about self-defense. If you get attacked, if there's an act of aggression against you, you are allowed to strike back. So according to the Charter, you still may use of force, but only in the cases of self-defense, so not in the case of offense. Now that sounds very logical, but here lawyers have talked a long time about the definition of self-defense. For instance, the definition of acts of aggression. So within the UN, they have negotiated for decades to come up with a list of what acts of aggression include. For instance, an arms embargo, is that an act of aggression? Sanctions, are that act of aggression? Or is only a military strike by nuclear weapons an act of aggression? So there's been a real debate on that, and that continues. Perhaps even more important is, what's meant by self-defense. For a long time, it was thought that the one that strikes first is not acting out of self-defense. If you invade a country, it's offensive, and that doesn't fall under Article 51. Yet it has also been argued in strategic studies for a long time that you might take preventive action to ensure that you get invaded in the first place. So where does that fall under self-defense? So we're really talking about a gray area. For instance, Russia and Georgia, they went to war in 2008. And both countries, Russia and Georgia, are still, diplomatically debating about who attacked first, whose fault was that war. So it's unclear in that sense often whether if you move first and strike first, whether that falls under self-defense or not. Another question is whether self-defense against terrorist organization is allowed. For instance, ISIS has been operating in Syria and in Iraq, and obviously from Syria and Iraq they have been organizing terrorist attacks on France and on other countries. So does that allow then France, under Article 51, to strike these terrorist targets within a sovereign state of Syria, within a sovereign state of Iraq? Now, the French and Americans have said, yes, we're allowed to strike terrorists everywhere, but it could obviously also be interpreted as essentially engaging in another sovereign country, an act of aggression in itself. So when it comes to the exception where you're allowed to use force, Article 51, we're talking still essentially about an incomplete policy program. It's not fully clear where the boundaries of the law are. So that's one exception to the use of force. The other exception is what the UN Charter calls its Chapter 7 about enforcement action. So while states are not allowed to fight wars against each other, the UN Security Council can mandate the military enforcement of actions. Particularly if the UN Security Council sees that there is a threat of the peace ongoing. But then the question really is, what constitutes a threat of the peace? Originally, threats of the peace were very much about interstate wars, say Costa Rica attacking the United States. But what about civil wars? Do they also are they also part of a threat of the peace? And originally, the Security Council said no, but at a certain point, civil wars were resulting in tremendous refugee flows in other countries. So there was a cross-border effect, and the UN Security Council then ruled, okay, civil wars might also be a threat to the peace. But what about human rights violations? What about climate change? The UN Security Council has only last year decided that climate change is a threat multiplier. So it really hasn't said yet that climate change might also be a threat to the peace, but it's debating these issues. In 2014, the UN Security Council announced that the Ebola virus would be a threat to the peace, but it has yet to decide that COVID-19 is a threat to the peace. So you can understand that also the definition of threat to the peace is very much debatable, and these things take place in the Security Council. The other question is here, how far the Security Council is allowed to go. And we've had a long debate on the responsibility to protect. Does the international community, with the Security Council on the lead, have the responsibility to protect also vulnerable populations against human rights abuses, war crimes, and all the other things? So can the international community, authorized by the Security Council, for instance, intervene in Libya in 2011 under the label of responsibility to protect? So here again, in addition to Article 51, we have a clause that allows for military action, but it also remains incomplete. So in that sense, we see here a policy program of the UN developing. Essentially, the bottom line is that it's not allowed to use force against each other if you're a member of the Security Council, but there are two exceptions, and these exceptions haven't been fully defined yet. And that also explains still a lot of ongoing debates about what now the rules and regulations of the UN and the UN Charter are. So I'm going to conclude here on the policy program of the UN. Before moving to the next topic on the operations of the UN, I'm just having a look at Amanda as moderator. Are there any questions currently on the policy program of the UN?
There aren't any questions currently, but if anyone wants to ask them, if you want to just go ahead and pop them in the chat, then we'll be able to have a quick look at that. So we'll maybe give you a little bit of time just to type any questions if you have any. Otherwise, we can just move on to the next section. Okay, I can't see any coming through just at the moment. So how about we just move on to the next section, and then if any come through, I can put them to you slightly later on.
Okay, that sounds perfect. So we've seen how the United Nations has, over the last 70 years, developed its policy program in the field of peace and security. But obviously, creating rules in New York is just one thing. The question is, how are they going to be implemented? What type of operations has the United Nations developed in support of these peace and security type of actions? And this is what we really talk about by operational activities of the UN. So these are the type of activities to implement that policy program. And essentially there are three operational activities. There's the peaceful settlement of disputes under Chapter 6 of the UN Charter, and there's enforcement action under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, and there is peacekeeping under what some have called Chapter 6.5 of the UN Charter. So I'm going to run through these type of actions. Now, the peaceful settlement of disputes is, if you like, one of the most important operational activities of the UN. And it can also be called consensual security. So at any moment, there are a whole range of type of dispute settlement activities going on under the UN flag or the flag of other international security organizations. And this is just one of these examples, the photo of the Cyprus talks between Northern Cyprus, Republic of Cyprus. You have the both heads of state sitting there together with UN mediators, and they're talking about how they can improve the situation in Cyprus. You see, it's quite colloquial, and chairs and probably with nice coffee and cake, and in that sense, they're trying, under the authority of the UN Secretary General, who you can see in the little picture above the fireplace, trying to settle these type of disputes. When it comes to dispute settlement in the UN, there are a number of operational activities. The first is the Security Council itself, which really is a forum for diplomacy. So the UN Charter says that any member state may bring any disputes to the attention of the Security Council, and if that happens, there's going to be debate in the Security Council about what's going on the ground. Both parties have to show up, and it's essentially diplomacy in front of the whole world. So I think that's really quite a first step, and we have these type of discussions in the Security Council all the time. But the Security Council can also go a step further. It can launch an investigation itself. Now, the Security Council has done this quite a bit in the past. It still calls for all sorts of investigations, but these days it doesn't very often do these type of investigations anymore itself. It rather relies on the UN Secretary General or the people working for the UN Secretary General. And in that sense, what has been really developed is the concept of good offices of the UN Secretary General, where the UN Secretary General, through quiet diplomacy, meets some of the conflicting parties, see whether he can bring them together, whether there's any way of settling disputes, and that's called good offices, and that takes really quite place hidden out of the view, but on a day-to-day basis. But the UN Secretariat and Secretary General can also go a step further and launch active mediation efforts. So within the Secretariat, there's a mediation unit with mediators who might fly all over the world and try to settle conflicts through mediation. Indeed, getting the conflicting parties to talk during peace talks, trying to come to peace agreements, and settle conflicts through peaceful means. One step further, the UN has also launched a whole range of special political missions. Some of them are really quite small, so it's a presence of a handful of UN officials on the ground who monitor peace situations. But in, for instance, Afghanistan and Iraq, the UN really has hundreds to 1,000 people working in special political missions and dealing with the continuous peaceful settlement of disputes. So that goes substantially further than the UN Secretary General making the occasional call or meeting people. These are really missions on the ground with hundreds of thousands of personnel dealing specifically with the peaceful settlement of disputes. Now, a final way of settle disputes is through the International Court of Justice. So if two countries disagree on something, they can decide to have their case adjudicated by the International Court of Justice in The Hague. So they go there, they present their case, and then the judges make a binding agreement. So a whole range of operational activities have been developed by the UN and its bodies in support of that policy program to ban the use of force. So it's not just about setting some rules in the UN Charter, it's also really about establishing these type of activities. So this is the peaceful settlement of disputes. Now, obviously, not all disputes can be settled through peaceful means, and sometimes there's need for a real stick. And that's where peace enforcement comes in. And I think this is really where you consider the UN Security Council as the world's police agent, who can literally launch military interventions, send fighter jets into Iraq, as this picture shows in 1991, to enforce the peace. Now, military enforcement or peace enforcement through military means is very often a last resort that the UN uses. And it's the final bit before, at the end of the long process, is the final bit before it launches military action. So the first thing that the Security Council needs to do is under Article 39 of the UN Charter, determine that the peace has been breached, so that there is a threat to the peace. They need to determine that. Secondly, what the Security Council very often does is that it imposes legally binding member obligations on states. So for instance, the Security Council says, well, you're going to have to stop fighting by that deadline, and we insist on that. So legally binding obligation about something that needs to happen. If that doesn't help, the UN Security Council can install non-military sanctions. It can, for instance, install trade sanctions or an arms embargo or smart sanctions against individuals. The difficulty, though, often with sanctions is their compliance. It may well be that the UN says something in New York, but obviously people need to comply with it. Now, the United States and the European Union have traditionally always complied with UN sanctions, so really installed them. But what about other countries? Do they also stop trading if there's an oil embargo or an arms embargo? Now, what happens occasionally is that the UN Security Council asks states for support. So it literally asks states or a regional organization to enforce an arms embargo. The case of Libya in 2011 is a good one. There, the arms embargo was enforced by NATO. So NATO put warships in front of the coast of Libya to make sure that nobody was smuggling arms into Libya. So sanctions is a very often used means in Security Council, but the Security Council also has the option of military enforcement, and it uses this one rarely. In the past, there have been a number of examples, like the intervention in Korea in 1950, the Operation Desert Storm in Iraq in 1991, the Libya intervention in 2011. So there's a handful of cases where the Security Council is set under Chapter 7 of the Charter. Listen, this threat of the peace is very serious. We're going to have to intervene now. Obviously, the main challenge here is that the Security Council doesn't always agree. And so within the Security Council, it might be relatively easy to determine that there's a breach to the peace. It might be easy to issue a statement that conflicting parties
we seem to be having a slight...
But it will be a lot more difficult for the Security Council to find consensus on sanctions.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah?
Just to say, I seem to be getting a bit of... yeah, I seem to be getting a bit of interruption with the sound. So I'm just going to turn off your webcam for the moment and see that hopefully that improves things. Okay, so we can still hear you. Would you be able to go back just a little bit about what you were saying on this slide? I think we missed some of what you were saying.
Sure. Some of the points that I've made is that the UN, in terms of the area of peace enforcement, has a number of operational activities as well, ranging from simply issuing a resolution imposing legally binding obligations on states to sanctions and military enforcement. And now the problem for the UN is that, first of all, when it comes to sanctions or military enforcement, it does not necessarily have the means to do so. There's no standing UN army, so it will always have to rely on countries to actually implement its measures. The second thing is that it's obviously very difficult to get consensus in the UN Security Council, and that permanent members of the Security Council have veto rights, so they can block sanctions, enforcement measures, or simply resolutions. Members of the Security Council have vetoed a lot of things, particularly during the Cold War. In the post-Cold War era, we've seen a lot more resolutions actually getting adopted, including sanctions resolutions and enforcement resolutions. But lately, it has been increasingly more difficult. For instance, on Syria, the UN Security Council has not been able to come to consensus. There's also an interesting anecdote when at Yalta, at the end of the Second World War, when Roosevelt and Churchill and Stalin met to negotiate the veto to negotiate the Security Council, Stalin at a certain moment literally asked to Churchill, what would happen if, for instance, China takes over Hong Kong, which was at the time still a British part of the UK, or what happens if Egypt nationalizes the Suez Canal? And then Churchill responded, well, we could veto that in the Security Council, showing a bit of the skepticism, certainly on the side of the Soviet Union, on the side of Stalin at that point, about what the Security Council could really achieve. And so even though there's an impressive slate of operational activities when it comes to peace enforcement, the question really is whether there is a willingness in the Security Council to go with that. Let me move to the next slide, which is about peacekeeping. There we go. So we initially talked about the peaceful settlement of disputes, which is the chapter 6 of the UN Charter, and we talked about peace enforcement, which is chapter 7 of the UN Charter. Now, the original UN Charter didn't foresee peacekeeping. Even though UN peacekeeping has grown into the most important operational activity of the UN in the field of peace and security. And a former Secretary General of the UN therefore referred to peacekeeping as chapter 6.5, somewhere in between enforcement and somewhere more, in between enforcement and peaceful settlement. So more than just peaceful means, there's military involved, but less than actually intervening in countries and showing military might. Now, the purpose of peacekeeping is really to keep the peace between different adversaries. But there's a whole range of different types of peacekeeping operations. So traditionally, UN peacekeeping was relatively light. The UN would send 1,000 blue helmets to, for instance, Cyprus to monitor the conflict between the North and the South, or to the Golan Heights, at Israel, or even some missions in Africa. So they were really quite light. They were not about intervening or about establishing peace. This was really just about monitoring existing peace agreements. In recent years, however, we've seen a development in two ways. First of all, we have seen a development towards robust peacekeeping missions. So peacekeeping missions that are not just 1,000 blue helmets, but perhaps 20,000 blue helmets in Mali or in Congo, that also have a mandate to restore a secure environment. So they can go in actively take on so-called spoilers and restore security. So that goes a step further than the monitoring missions. What we've also seen very much is multidimensional peacekeeping, including roles on mediation, human rights, peace building, democratization, good governance, gender equality, and so forth. The logic here is that by just having blue helmets, one can keep the peace, but one cannot really engage in peace building, in making a country really peaceful again, making society really peaceful again. So that has been quite an important development, and some of these robust peacekeeping missions and multidimensional peacekeeping missions are very much under, I think traditional consensual monitoring missions do a lot of good. It's questionable whether that's similar the case with robust peacekeeping missions or the multidimensional ones. Also from a budgetary point of view, robust peacekeeping, multidimensional peacekeeping is a lot more expensive, and robust peacekeeping leads to casualties also on the side of the UN. So these have been really important developments over, say, the last 15 years or so. And it makes peacekeeping now a much more heavy engagement than it used to be. For instance, currently there are about 100,000 blue helmets over 13 peacekeeping operations worldwide. So that's a really substantial engagement of the UN. And the budget for UN peacekeeping is the double of the budget for the UN for everything else combined. So peacekeeping budget is the double of the regular budget of the UN. And that tells you something about how important peacekeeping has become over the last 15 years, and how many peacekeepers from all over the world are trying to bring conflicts in difficult places to a close. So 3 operational activities that the UN has developed to keep the peace and security: peacekeeping, peace enforcement, and the settlement by peaceful means. So these are the 3 operational activities. What I want to do in the final bit of the talk is to talk about the effectiveness of the UN in keeping the peace through its policy program and operational activities. But I'm going to pause a moment again before I move towards effectiveness to answer any questions.
Yes, we did have a question come through, which was about whether you could talk a little bit more about how the UN deals with conflicts about new or existing countries. So they gave the example of China claiming Tibet and Taiwan, and how the UN deals with this.
I think that's a very important and good question. Particularly when the UN was founded and in its initial years, it was really quite conscious about all sorts of colonial countries becoming newly independent countries. And that also resulted in a whole range of economic and social questions, but also in a number of conflictual questions. And some of the initial peacekeeping operations really developed out of that context. One of the interesting things, particularly with China, is that China has really changed its position towards UN peacekeeping. So originally it was very, very skeptical of UN peacekeeping. It thought that peacekeeping was about intervening in other countries, and China had a very strong non-interventionist type of policy. Also with reference, obviously, to Taiwan, Tibet, and other places. So China was skeptical about UN peacekeeping, wanted essentially to get the UN out. Now, that was a couple of decades ago. Then China became a bit more indifferent to UN peacekeeping during the 1990s. But China currently very much is a big supporter of UN peacekeeping. And of all the permanent members of the Security Council, China has by far the highest number of blue helmets deployed in peacekeeping operations. So whereas the US and France and the UK talk a lot about peacekeeping, China is actually delivering some of the resources. Now, this has not been entirely without keeping in mind China's own interest. For instance, China is deploying a lot of peacekeepers to African regions where there are rich in mineral resources and oil. So, for instance, China is playing a big role in peacekeeping operations in South Sudan. China is also active in Congo in peacekeeping. So it's not entirely non-related to Chinese self-interest, but China has really turned around from being fundamentally opposed to UN peacekeeping, intervening in other countries, to now actually effectively building security and peace and stability in a number of conflict countries, with an obvious interest of then subsequently doing also business. So I think that's an interesting story. Now, China is, or the UN is not deploying peacekeepers to Taiwan or to Tibet. That's out of the question. And in that sense, because China is a permanent member of the Security Council, the UN also cannot do too many things in these areas. But it's interesting that China's general perspective has really changed on some of these UN activities.
Great. I think that's it for questions at this time.
Okay, so let me talk a bit about the effectiveness of UN peacekeeping, because I think that's also a topic of much debate. Now I'm going to do two things. I'm going to, if I get to the next slide. Yeah, one back. Two slides on the effectiveness of UN peace and security. I mean, I think the first thing to look at is the number of global armed conflicts that have emerged since the creation of the United Nations. Now, this I found a very interesting graph, because essentially it shows two things. It shows that type of colonial conflicts and conflicts between countries, the so-called interstate conflicts, they hardly take place anymore. It's very rare these days that countries go to war against each other, that Canada invades the United States, that France invades Germany, that Egypt goes to war with Ethiopia. That rarely happens. And you can see that these dark gray graphs below, they're near absent. At the same time, what we've seen, particularly since the 1980s and the 1990s, is a quite substantial increase in civil wars, intrastate wars. Now there has been a drop during the 2000s, then an increase again. But I think the picture really that clearly emerges is that when we talk about conflict and global armed conflict, we should be talking more about civil wars and less about interstate wars. And arguably, the UN and its policy programs have really focused on prohibiting wars against states and haven't focused enough about civil wars and about how to address the root causes of civil wars. Now, obviously, the UN has deployed a lot of peacekeepers, the 100,000 I've talked about in the previous slide, but that clearly has not been enough, not effective enough in really reducing civil conflicts across the globe. So a lot more will have to be done in terms of mediation and peacekeeping when it comes to civil wars. But I think we can therefore say that when it comes to the effectiveness of the UN policy program, it's been really quite effective in banning wars between states, even when Russia intervened in Ukraine in 2014. There was general outrage about this type of activity should not happen anymore in the 21st century. And it is also really rarely happening. At the same time, there's still plenty of conflicts to go around, and the UN has been less effective in dealing with those. What's also interesting is having a look at the academic literature on the effectiveness of peacekeeping. And there are lots of academics who really ask this question and try to assess it. Now, it's really quite difficult to measure the effectiveness of peacekeeping, but one key indicator has been where scholars looked at the duration of peace after agreements have been negotiated. So in some cases, when a peace agreement is negotiated, UN peacekeepers are deployed. In other cases, UN peacekeepers are not deployed, and scholars have looked at the difference in how long the peace actually lasts in two cases. You know, are there peacekeeping operations or not? Does the peacekeeping operation that increase the durability of the peace agreement? And there's very strong evidence for that. So the moment you deploy a UN peacekeeping operation, the peace tends to last longer. So it's a really important positive outcome for the effectiveness of peacekeeping. Yet it's less clear whether the different types of peacekeeping operations have an effect, whether robust type of missions are more effective than the traditional light monitoring missions. So scholars still really debate about the need to have those type of robust missions. What's also less clear is when and where peacekeeping operations are deployed. I mean, if peacekeeping operations are deployed to very easy type of conflicts, where there's a lot of prospect of peace, and then the peace lasts, well, that's perhaps not the peacekeeping operation creating that effect. And if the difficult conflicts are ignored, is peacekeeping then really doing its job? So that's another important question that scholars have recently looked at. Where do these peacekeeping operations get deployed? And also within countries, do they get deployed only to the capitals that tend to be relatively stable, or to conflict areas on the borders? So important questions there about the effectiveness of peacekeeping. And then finally, there's the historical record of failures of UN peacekeeping, and peacekeeping really doesn't have history with it. One only needs to talk about the genocides in Bosnia, Rwanda, the situation in Somalia, or how UN peacekeepers brought cholera, the disease, to Haiti only a decade ago. So tremendous amount of failures of UN peacekeeping. They loom large, but beyond some of these major accidents, these major failures, the overall picture that emerges is that peacekeeping does have a positive effect on the peace. That peace lasts longer, and therefore that we can talk about the effectiveness of peacekeeping and say generally that this is a good thing, that the UN really has made a difference through these peacekeeping missions and sending out these blue helmets. Before I get to the conclusion, are there perhaps still any questions that you want me to answer?
Yes, there was one that came in about whether the US's stance in the UN has changed due to the Trump government.
That's an important question, and the answer is very much so. First of all, why it's an important question is I believe the webinar of 2 weeks ago, I talked a bit about, what are the different sorts of preferences and interests that countries have in the UN and the UN Security Council. Now, for a lot of countries, their preferences and interests tend to be quite stable. France and the United Kingdom generally support multilateral solutions. Russia and China are typically skeptical about interventionism. Russia tends to be a bit ruder in the Security Council, China a bit more constructive. But the only country that really seems to be changing quite dramatically in the Security Council in terms of its positions is indeed the United States. Now, this is a relatively recent phenomenon, so it's not the case that Democrats and Republicans have always disagreed, but it's certainly clearly so since the Bush administration and Ambassador John Bolton, that the United States has been really quite obstructive in the Security Council. And during the Obama administration, with Ambassador Susan Rice and others, that the United States has really tried to reach out, negotiate compromise, and build on peacekeeping. Particularly Ambassador Susan Rice was instrumental in launching robust peacekeeping, multi-dimensional operations. Now, the position of Trump has been very different. Already its first ambassador, she immediately started, saying, "I'm going to keep names of everybody who agrees with the United States and people who disagree." She immediately launched an offensive to reduce the budget of UN peacekeeping, or at least the part of the budget that the United States was paying. So there has been, a real escalation because of the Trump administration there, which probably goes even beyond what John Bolton did when he was ambassador under the Bush administration. And John Bolton is still the person who told us that the UN Secretariat has 50 plus floors and can easily lose 20 or so. So that was John Bolton under the Bush administration, but I think the Trump administration has has been worse. And it's really quite telling, for instance, that the Security Council under Obama was capable of adopting a resolution saying that Ebola was a threat to the peace. Whereas the current Security Council has not been able to adopt a resolution on COVID-19. And this very much has to do with the Trump administration on the other hand, but also the type of conflicts that the Trump administration picks with China. So the type of rivalry that we see between the United States and China is very much present currently in the Security Council, and the absence to get some work done. Now, it's probably goes too far to blame all of this on Trump. I think that the work in the Security Council has become a lot more difficult, particularly since the Arab Spring. So where the Security Council still adopted a resolution on Libya in 2011, where the international community intervened in Libya, from that moment onwards, we have essentially seen a deterioration. Particularly Russia and China said, well, we adopted a security resolution, but it was not the idea that NATO would intervene in Libya. So essentially, Russia and China have blocked every single attempt to talk about Syria in the Security Council. So that was still under the Obama administration. The Security Council has had difficult relations between the United States and Russia since the Russian intervention in Crimea, in Ukraine in 2014. So it's not that the current deadlock in the Security Council can be fully explained by the Trump administration, but certainly the tone and the rhetoric of the Trump administration have fundamentally changed compared to the Obama administration. Yes.
Great. And we had another question about, in the debate about the effectiveness of peacekeeping missions, the robust missions have quite a heterogeneous elements. Which element would you say are more discussed?
I think that's a good question. I think one of the one of the difficulties with the robust peacekeeping has been that UN peacekeeping operations traditionally have to be impartial. So they have to be impartial within conflict. They are to implement the peace. They are to implement peace agreements, and they don't choose sides. At the same time, there has been a long experience that not all conflicting parties are actually quite happy with the presence of peacekeeping operations. Because the moment you deploy a peacekeeping operation to a country, it often cements the status quo and therefore benefits the government in power. So rebel groups often are not particularly supportive of peacekeeping operations and have therefore also been attacking peacekeeping operations, really requiring an additional level of robustness. But I think where things have become really quite heated is, for instance, the peacekeeping intervention brigade that the UN has launched in Congo, or aggressive action by the UN against rebels in Mali, in support of the Malian government. Now, the US and France, in both cases, have been really quite pushing for stronger robustness role, and people question here, is this a good thing? Is this good for the international community, or is this just simply pursuing French and American interest by other means? So I think where particularly the debate is heated is when it really comes to these type of intervention, military, aggressive type of actions that are now part of the mandate of some UN peacekeeping operations.
Okay, and one more. Are the peace strategies and UN strategies on economic development related? And if so, how?
I think that's a very important question as well. For a long time, the UN has obviously adopted the concept of human security. So that security is no longer just between countries or between nations, but also the security of the individual. And human security is not just security from fear, or freedom from fear, but also freedom from want. So that's where the economic and the security come together. What we generally see with international security organizations is an increasing integrated or comprehensive approach, which not just includes indeed peacekeeping, but has multidimensional type of missions where peace building, but also economic and social support are part of the equation. So I think this is very much part of the discussion. What's a bit more difficult is to estimate the effectiveness of all these type of actions. It's relatively easy to estimate whether a peacekeeping operation has kept the peace. It's a lot more difficult to create causal links between type of multidimensional peacekeeping operations and also how a country has prospered economically. So I think that's where the academic debate currently is. What I'm going to do is I'm going to move now to the conclusion, and perhaps then there's still time for one or two more questions. So talking about the conclusion, I've looked at three things today. I've looked at the policy program of the UN, how the UN has essentially regulation to ban the use of force, even though it's incomplete. I've looked at the operational activities, how the UN gives meaning essentially to these policy programs through peaceful settlement of disputes and peace enforcement, but also peacekeeping operations. And I've talked about the effectiveness of UN policies and operations in the sense that we've seen a decrease in interstate conflict, but there's difficulty with measurement, even though it's generally positive. But there have also been some major UN failures when it comes to peace and security. So I think this is a way of looking at all the activities of international organizations, identifying their policy programs, and then discussing the type of operational activities that international organizations deploy in support of these policy programs, and then finally to think about measurement. So while the topic of today was really quite peace and security, one can also do that with trade and development, human rights, climate change, migration, global health governance, and all the other points on the international agenda. Now, before really concluding, I still want to pay a bit of attention to the final webinar that's being planned in 2 weeks. So we talked about the theory and history of international organizations, about policymaking in international organizations, and the activities of international organizations. What I really want to talk about in 2 weeks is about the crisis, the current crisis of international organizations, the crisis of liberal international order, the crisis of multilateralism, the challenge of type of informal organizations, private authority. So where are we going to be heading with international organizations? And that will also be the concluding webinar for this series. So with that said, perhaps there's still 5 minutes to take some questions, if there's still any.
Yes, there's one that's just come through. How does the UN relate to North Korea?
How the UN relates to North Korea? I think that's a very interesting point. So in 1950, the UN Security Council authorized military intervention in Korea. Now the background was really quite interesting. Because you can wonder, why did the Security Council do that? After all, there's also the Soviet Union and there's China on the Security Council, right? Well, at the time in 1950, the Chinese government was sitting in Taiwan, so it wasn't the Beijing government sitting in the Security Council. So the split in China really was fundamental, and the government in Taiwan was keeping the seat of the Security Council. So China was out in that decision. And Russia was also out because the Soviet Union actually complained to the UN that China was not having the seat. So it kept its seat empty for a brief moment in the Security Council. And at that point, there were only 3 permanent members of the Security Council left, the United Kingdom, France, and the United States. And they agreed on military enforcement action in North Korea, essentially leading to the Korean War of 1950, 1953, in which China obviously got involved as well. And I think you can also imagine that that created hostility towards the UN as such, a long-held hostility. Currently in North Korea, they're mediation type of activities. They're the six-party talks where different countries are involved. But we have obviously seen in recent years on the Trump administration direct bilateral talks between the American president and North Korean leaders on non-proliferation. So there are a number of activities in that sense going on when it comes to mediation. The effectiveness of these type of activities is questionable. It's not clear that the intervention of the Trump administration has led to a resolvement of the conflict. But I think that's quite interesting in general, is that when you look at different type of conflicts, some are dealt with directly by the UN, some are dealt with by a group of countries, often neighbors, some powerful states. Some are dealt with by non-governmental mediators. So there are quite a number of renowned non-governmental mediators. Nobel laureate Martti Ahtisaari, a former Finnish president, is one example of a powerful figure who in a non-governmental role has mediated a number of conflicts. The African Union might be involved, and it's really quite interesting to see how in different type of conflicts you have different sorts of groupings of mediators involved. Is there one final question?
No, that seems to be all of the questions that have come through for the moment. So just to take this opportunity to say thank you very much for the webinar today. I think it's been a fascinating topic for us to focus on, and thank everybody on the line for the questions that have come through. And we hope that you'll be able to join us in 2 weeks' time for the webinar on the future of international organisations. So thank you very much, everybody, and we hope to see you in 2 weeks' time. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.